Uygur started his media career in talk radio. Before founding of the Young Turks, Cenk was a movement conservative, akin to someone like Ben Shapiro. He openly acknowledged this as part of his ideological evolution. His views then included support for the Iraq War, conservative social views, including support for traditional gender roles and opposition to LGBTQ rights, libertarian leanings and support for small government, and a general support for the Republican Party. So between 1996 and 2002, he worked in radio programs from Boston to Miami. His content and commentary during this period echoed his then conservative stance. Throughout his career, Cenk has faced criticism for past statements and writings, but nothing comes into comparison with the misogynist blog posts he wrote in the early 2000s. He was forced to publicly apologize for these remarks later on in his career, attributing them to earlier phases of his personal and ideological transition. Here are some examples of the controversial remarks he made. Cenk wrote about women being less interested in sex than men, stating,
Obviously, the genes of women are flawed. They do not want to have sex nearly as often as needed for the human race to get along peaceably and fruitfully.
he objectified women by criticizing their appearances.
There are no women that are hot enough on South Beach. When I say this, of course, I am referring to the limitless standard of perfection that I create in my head.
He also made disregarding remarks about overweight women, stating they should not wear revealing clothing. Cenk regularly mocked feminists and feminism in general. Though exact quotes on this front are less frequently cited, his tone were often dismissive of the gender equality movement. He described his younger self as pursuing women aggressively, recounting instances where he boasted about his interactions.
I had one of the best nights of my life in Atlantic City, where two girls made out with each other while I hooked up with the second one.
Cenk also commented on how he would assess women at parties in a manner many found objectifying. Here is a video clip showing Cenk Uygur addressing these allegations back in 2019.
So one of the other things that's likely to come up are the blogs that you wrote years ago. And those blogs came up a few years ago. Some of the conservative writers out there revealed them, and you were forced to apologize about them. So can you talk about what was in those old blogs and why you apologized?
Okay, so the blogs are bad, and it was when I was a politically incorrect Republican, and so if you want, I can get into my whole history of why I grew up a liberal Republican in New Jersey, and then eventually became a progressive. The short answer is I believe in facts, and the more facts that came in, the more I realized the Republicans were full of crap. But back then, I was trying to prove how politically incorrect I am. So I wrote a lot of silly things, wrong things, outrageous things, and but also, by the way, I will say that some of them, the ones that are most often quoted, were jokes about myself, where I was obviously making fun of myself. So, like I said, something about women having poor genes because they won't sleep with me. That's obviously a joke about me, right? So, having said that, should I have made that joke? No. But what I'm amused by, yeah, I'll say it, is that when Republicans, so if you're a Democrat and you're a progressive and you're bothered by those old words, you're 100% right, right? But Republicans who revel in so-called political incorrectness, now pretending that that younger Republican idiot, that's me, okay, back then, did something that offends them. You're not offended. You weren't offended back then. You're not offended now. You're trying to use it as a political tool. And by the way, if you're saying, hey, you should vote for a Republican in that race instead of Cenk, because back then he was a Republican idiot. Well, what does that make you voting for a Republican idiot today? At least I learned.
In 2002, Cenk Uygur launched The Young Turks. Initially airing on Sirius satellite radio, TYT expanded its reach by starting a daily news video show on YouTube in 2005. The name, quote unquote, The Young Turks, has been a point of controversy because it references the Young Turk movement, a nationalist populist reform group in the Ottoman Empire during the early 20th century. While the movement initially aimed for modernization and constitutional governance, its leadership later orchestrated the Armenian Genocide during World War I, in which an estimated 1.2 to 1.5 million Armenians were systemically butchered. Critics argue that adopting the term the Young Turks is insensitive, particularly to Armenians and other affected communities, as it invokes a regime associated with genocide and atrocities. Cenk and the TYT network have defended the name as referring to its broader meaning: young progressives challenging the status quo, and not the historical regime. Nevertheless, the controversy has persisted, especially given Uyghur's past denial of the Armenian genocide, though he later apologized and clarified his position.
You have a past of denying the Armenian genocide, and that is going to come up during this race.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important for you to discuss the Armenian genocide, both your past position on it and where you stand today.
Yeah. Okay. Fair. First of all, the Armenian genocide happened, and if you have read online that when I was a kid in college, and even a little bit later than that, when I was a young guy, that I denied it. That is true. Okay, and the reason is I grew up with only the Turkish side of the story. So I read all these accounts, and back then I didn't have the context of having done this show, having learned, having grown up, having matured. So I remember reading this one thing of an American colonel who said that the Armenians had returned to Turkey entirely fat and unmassacred. And I remember writing that in an editorial or something like that. Looking back on it, that is so embarrassing. How childish. That guy obviously wanted some sort of contract or wanted some sort of deal. Nobody returned. Look at Turkey. There's still some Armenians in Turkey. When I grew up in Turkey, I was 8 years old. We had Armenian friends, but there used to be a lot of Armenians, certainly in Eastern Turkey and yes, in Western Turkey as well. They're not there. They didn't return. They didn't return fat and unmassacred. That's preposterous. Now, as an adult, when I read that, I go, oh, obviously that guy has some interest that he's trying to protect. So, and to look, Turks get both sides get super mad about this, and it's because it touches their core identity. And so Turks say, no, I never want to say, guys, almost everybody admits there's massacres. But Srebrenica, 8,000 people died, and they were targeted in that case because they were Muslims. The UN calls that a genocide. If that's a genocide, what happened to the Armenians is clearly a genocide. Then Turks will get touchy and they'll say, oh yeah, what happened to the Native Americans? That's a genocide. Well, you're right, it is.
It was.
So why don't you just say it? Why don't you admit that it was an Armenian genocide? And yes, it was a Native American genocide. There's nothing wrong with that. So if you read out there anywhere that I still deny it, that is nothing but a lie.
So, in this transition period between 2002 and 2006, Young Turks quickly became a platform for critiquing both major political parties. Though its tone were increasingly critical of the Republicans and right-wing politics. During this period, Cenk abandoned his previously conservative views and became a progressive. According to Cenk Uygur himself, the reasons he left the right were the following. Cenk initially supported the Iraq War, but became deeply critical of it after realizing the flawed rationale and the devastating consequences. This disillusionment extended to the broader US military interventions and neoconservative foreign policy. At the same time, he perceived a growing disconnect between the Republican rhetoric and their actions, such as their support for government subsidies to big corporations and increased government overreach, like the Patriot Act. On social issues, Cenk claimed that as he engaged with more diverse perspectives, he changed his positions to become more and more inclusive and understanding of women, minorities, and the LGBTQ community. He credited exposure to progressive arguments and his own rethinking of fairness and rights as instrumental in this evolution. Also, according to Cenk, he became increasingly critical of systemic corruption and outsized role of money in policy making, aligning with progressive economic and political reforms. In large, Cenk Uygur described his transition as a natural outcome of questioning and exploring issues more deeply. According to him, his intellectual curiosity led him to reevaluate his beliefs, moving towards evidence based conclusions that often align with progressive values. So between 2006 and 2010, Cenk continued his transition to the left. His commentary increasingly centered on economic inequality, corruption, and the failures of neoliberal policies. He fully embraced progressive social issues, including marriage equality, which was a key topic during this period. He also became an outspoken advocate for urgent climate action, criticizing fossil fuels and government inaction. Importantly, Cenk publicly changed his position on the Armenian Genocide in 2010, after growing criticism for his previous denial, particularly from Armenian communities and the broader progressive public. Cenk acknowledged the atrocities of the genocide. He apologized for his earlier stance and stated that he had been wrong. Here is a clip from the early days of the Young Turks.
These people who say, well, you know what, we got hit on September 11th, so let's just give up some of our rights. They're flat out cowards. You know, through hundreds of years, through many bloody wars, much bloodier than this, people fought for and defended that and died for that Constitution. At the first sign of trouble, us generation of cowards, and that's how history will see us, we give up our rights. They fought so hard for those rights. And we give it up at the first time a snake oil salesman steps up and says, hey, don't worry, I'll protect you. I'll give you absolute security. Just let me take away some of your rights. And all those guys who died, all our soldiers died for that freedom, and we give it away. It's sickening, and we ought to be embarrassed.
That pretty much sums up his career before the 2010s. Time for some analysis. So Cenk's career as a political pundit is inseparable from his channel The Young Turks. The context here is it was the wild west for online news shows in '05. Cenk and TYT in one way or another was the OG. He started a massively successful channel on YouTube in the very early days of the site. It later expanded into a network of progressive commentators. Many of the biggest names in that niche, from Hassan Piker to Kyle Kulinski, were inspired by the Young Turks. So Cenk's business model was centered at himself as the front of the channel, surrounded by a group of hosts, many of them personal friends of Cenk, and also some outside personalities who joined as guests from time to time, providing a diverse experience on the show. It had a more welcoming, more relatable, and more down to the earth atmosphere. It was a very innovative business model for its time because its competitors were essentially newspapers, talk radio, and cable TV, none of which provided these experiences. He was a successful capitalist through and through. Aside from the Young Turks channel, Cenk's ideological transition, or rather I would call ideological reversal, is also very interesting. I don't know if there's a better example of a complete 180 of someone's politics. Well, except there is someone, and that is Dave Rubin. Cenk switched his beliefs on almost every issue between 2002 and 2005. I'm not going to tell you if I think it was a genuine ideological reversal or a savvy opportunist move. Frankly, I can tell. I don't know him personally, but what I do know is that Cenk, till this day, still accuses Dave Rubin of being a grifter.
I'm not like Dave Rubin, a giant sellout fraud who changed all of his positions and is totally useless and it shouldn't even be on here. He's just a waste of space.
Wow. Really?
Yeah.
After what all
Okay,
Dave
yeah.
said about coming
Yeah.
together?
Yeah.
If we observe and compare the transitions of Cenk and Dave, both occurred in their late 30s. Both took about 3 years to complete. Both were very extensive in the sense that they were 100% reversals. Both occurred after leaving their previous employers. Long or short, they were surprisingly similar. Whatever that entails, it's up to you.